Is capitalism in crisis, question mark? I say no. Andrew already answered that as yes. That's what makes obviously the world go round. Our next guest penned a piece on how to save capitalism from itself in this month's issue of Fast Company. Joining us now is that author, Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation. Of course, our guest host, Starwood Capital's, it's right in his name, Starwood Capital's Barry Sternlicht. So maybe you can break the tie, although Daryl might put it back to a tie. So Daryl, you run the Ford Foundation, and it's philanthropic. A lot of philanthropy comes from guys that succeed guys and gals that succeed in the private sector. So I would start with that. And the other thing is, and I agree with you with this, is that if you look at inequality of opportunity in the United States, that's what we want to fix, and that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about simple redistribution. If we want to do that, and we want the government to help us do that, I would think capitalism has to be the engine that supplies the tax revenues to the government, which allows us to equalize opportunity. So I don't think we're really talking about capitalism and changing that. I think we're talking about ways of equalizing opportunity. Have I got that wrong?
Well, I think we are talking about the American dream. The American dream has been made possible by a capitalist system that has produced shared prosperity.
Right.
So people like me who start out with being the first to go to college, a grandfather who was basically illiterate, and today I'm certainly in the 1%. That was made possible because we had an economy that made it possible for me to receive an education, to have scholarships provided by private philanthropists, and then to work in a market that rewarded me for my entrepreneurship and my hard work.
All sounds good so far.
The challenge today is that mobility escalator that I got on, and that probably most of you got on, has stopped. And in fact, that American dream as we know it, which was the envy of the world, is no longer the envy of the world. In fact, the United States has fallen behind other industrialized nations in terms of economic mobility. So if you want the American dream today, you ought to move to Canada, because Canada is doing better than the United States on economic mobility.
So they still have a capitalistic system in Canada.
Indeed, and exactly. So they've got a capitalist system, and they are doing better than us on providing opportunity.
So you want to work around the edges of capitalism?
I want to challenge capitalism to do what it's supposed to do, and that is to provide opportunity for as many people.
But this sounds like it has to do with more with tax policy than capitalism itself.
Well, the relationship in a democratic capitalist system is always one of the relationship between public policy and the markets. That's our system.
Okay, but I still don't understand how you're not saying that you want to pursue a different system than capitalism. You're saying you want to change tax policy and work the capitalist system so that it equalizes opportunity again, or returns.
Yes, I would like.
So what do we do? I mean, what's the answer?
We do have to talk about tax policy.
Right. Well, that's really all we're talking about here.
Well, it's not all we're talking about, because at the end of the day, opportunity isn't enough if we have a system where there is bias, where there is discrimination.
That has nothing to do with capitalism.
It doesn't have anything to do with capitalism, but it does have something to do with public policy and the system in which
but our whole premise is capitalism in crisis, so that's why I keep coming back to whether.
To my mind, the question isn't, is capitalism in crisis? It's, is the American dream still possible?
Okay, that's a totally different.
What went wrong? You won't answer the question. What went wrong?
What went wrong?
You would say America is far more interested in discrimination, is a better, I would think, a better nation today than it was 100 years ago on all these.
Absolutely.
We had affirmative action. We did all these programs. I mean, where did it go off the rails in your mind?
Well, I certainly think that we've got some policies that were designed into the system that have made it harder for people to get on that mobility escalator. Right. So public schools that have continued
the deterioration of public schools.
Exactly. Right. Public schools. A criminal justice system that ensnares too many people of color, for example. Right? So there are a number of ways in which we have in our system ways that reduce opportunity. So it is both the policies that produce these outcomes, and it is the culture that enables the policies and that, in fact, reaffirms some of the discriminatory patterns that we all know exist in our society.
I'll go even further. You ready for this?
I guess so.
No. If you think about what he's saying, and this actually does have to do with capitalism and the power and influence of American corporations. If you go and look at the political donations of American corporations from the treasuries of these companies, I'm talking biggest companies in America, and you look at who they historically support Republicans and Republican governors associations and the like, right? And if you really look at the kinds of the positions that those people have taken, and they're often supporting those individuals because of tax policy and things that will benefit the company, but the other related policies that those individuals have actually don't help with the bias issue, with the sustainability issue, with protecting LGBT rights, with all of those other things. They're actually the antithesis of that. And so if you think about the money that's being spent in that way and the influence that that has. Meanwhile, you have, the Ford Foundation also has influence, right? You give money to all sorts of different organizations, too.
We don't give political contributions, but we absolutely support organizations that have an opinion about policy. So, for example, what happened to those profit-sharing plans for workers? My grandfather had a third-grade education. He worked as a porter for an oil company down in Texas, where I'm from. But when he retired, because of the profit-sharing program of that company, he retired with enough stock to live a life of dignity. Today, those programs don't exist anymore. What happened to those programs? Why do we not have employee profit-sharing programs anymore? That used to be a feature. That was part of the public policy, the private policy, corporate policy that made it possible.
What happens if I said to you that part of this issue? What happens if I said to you that I'm going to go crazy? I'm going to go in a totally different direction. What if I told you that the American dream was an historical aberration? That the mobility that you're looking and that we all talk about, the sort of mobility that took place between the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which was effectively the sort of Leave It to Beaver American dream, where there was plentiful outcomes for all. That if you look in 1980 when wages start to stagnate, and you say to yourself, why did this happen? Is it really because the American dream is dead, or is it because for 50 years after World War II, the rest of the world was completely out of business? We were a monopoly power with monopoly rents. We could afford to lift boats in ways that were almost artificial. And come 1980, when wages start to stagnate, Japan, Germany, the rest of the world comes online, if you will, and all of a sudden we're now competing with them.
Oh, and we're exporting them, our manufacturing. Right, because my father ran a factory in Norwalk, Connecticut, right? They made flashlights. Walmart says, I want that flashlight for $2. He can't make it for $2 in Norwalk with his immigrant workforce, all carded, by the way. And so he exported. He went to Hong Kong, first trip to Hong Kong, found a Chinese manufacturer because Walmart wanted. So I've been thinking about this because I think what happened, right? Walmart has 1.5 million workers in the United States. They're 1% of the workforce. So they manufacture all these goods because we consumers in this country wanted to buy our Nike sneakers for $100 for the last 30 years. Right? We kept exporting it to different and lower labor markets. So it's interesting because I think I'm taking to heart exactly what you said. I was thinking about People Express, which none of us remember, but maybe we're old enough to remember, right? And they had this great stock sharing program. And I started Starwood Hotels. I wanted to give stock to all the housekeepers, which I did. And then I realized they didn't value it. And they sold the stock as soon as they got the stock because they needed the extra money. And then your stock goes down, they're unhappy. And so I look at People's Express. When the stock was going up, it was the greatest story in the world. When it started to fall apart, everyone felt disenfranchised and upset at the company for some factors that probably were beyond their control. So it's kind of like a very complicated situation. Like, activists try to get companies to maximize their cash flows. They're supported by the pension funds like Ford Foundation. I'm sure you have hedge funds. I'm sure you have equities. You know, we've got to maximize profits. But I think the new business roundtable discussion around the multiple stakeholders is actually pushing capitalism in the right way. I think it's certainly got a seat at the table today, which you hadn't heard in the last decade really as much about employees, and the inequality discussion is real, and it's a real challenge for the country. It's a big problem.
I think the news from the BRT is actually great news. They, in fact, rejected the idea of shareholder primacy and talked very specifically about stakeholder paradigm, which includes, of course, shareholders at the top. But what about workers, customers, the communities where you live and work? all of these stakeholders have to be given some say. So if it's only the activists, only the shareholders, we're always going to be extracting from the company the value that might go to other stakeholders.
Just have to be a successful, thriving company to do all the philanthropic and
have
good deeds
that's
that
correct.
you want to do.
And
Otherwise,
a
it's
long-term shareholder base that rewards that.
Right.
Exactly.
As opposed to the
Exactly.
guys who want you to make an extra 3 cents that quarter.
Exactly.
Right? And they know what they can cut.
But there still are
we
tough
built
decisions that need to be made at times. Where you'd rather, if 20% of the workforce, because of whatever happens externally, needs to be let go to keep the company solvent, it's better than 100% of the people losing their jobs with a bankruptcy.
I would agree with that.
How big is
But it's going to look like you're not satisfying the worker the stakeholder in that case. When there's times where capitalism can be Darwinian to some extent, but we've learned even creative destruction is going to dislocate people, and it's heartbreaking to watch. But sometimes it has to be done for the good of everything.
So I'm in the real estate business, and we have Google ratings of our apartment complexes. There are TripAdvisor ratings of our hotels. Why aren't there? There should be a metric for shareholders that care to rate companies on this diverse scorecard, not just their ROE. And their scorecard might be their philanthropy, the way they take care of their customers. And do you think institutions would care?
That, in fact, is
Would they
happening.
care?
So Paul Tudor Jones started something called Just Capital, which the Ford Foundation is a partner in.
Friends with
it,
Paul.
in fact, does what you just said. And so we
Do you
need...
think shareholders, you think institutional capital will reward the best companies or the companies with the biggest margins? Because that's the tension between
It's really
the two.
interesting. 2 years ago, American Airlines announced that they were going to be giving more of their profits to employees, and they immediately got hit by Wall Street.
Yeah.
And so their stock went down when they announced that they were going to share more of their profits with employees.
We also need to separate crony capitalism and corporatism from what capitalism really espouses in its core.
Yes.
And what it really espouses is that, that the means of production is better served when it's left in the private sector rather than, and that's really all it says. All these other ancillary things that we're talking about, some of it is anti-capitalism, crony capitalism, corporations controlling, through lobbying, controlling the government. That's not what.
Well, that wasn't what Adam Smith had in mind. You're absolutely right.
So if you go back and look at what we're actually talking about, that's why I think the answer is in crisis is no. I think that every generation needs to be educated on the benefits and what. Really, if you look at how the world has changed since you were able to own an idea back in whatever it was, the 17th century, once property rights and being able to benefit from your own success, once that became something you could do, that's when you saw incomes rise.
Well, every generation has a challenge, and the challenge of our generation is inequality. And if we continue to have the levels of inequality that we have in this country, it is going to be harmful for our long-term
Darren, in the last
interests.
2.5 years, the middle class, the $5,000 raise plus $1,000 from the tax cut. George W. Bush, 8 years, $400 increase. Barack Obama, 8 years, $1,000 increase. So middle incomes have gone up $5,000. Add the tax, that's $6,000 in 2.5 years. We're trying. There are some positive things that can happen organically.
There are absolutely some positive things.
And at least we're going to redistribute opportunity, not just move the balance sheet.
We need more opportunity in this country.
We need to redistribute opportunity.
We'll all agree on that.
Okay. Darren, thank you.
Thank you.
And they should have the G7 at Sea Island. I mean, we've both of these things we have figured we've
Some agreement.
got both of these things fixed.
Silent agreement.